The neckline is the very first thing anyone notices about a garment. Today, we are taking a complete look at how to build one from scratch, from drafting the initial shape, to preventing the fabric from stretching out, to permanently hiding the raw edges inside. To start, you need a basic bodice sloper. This block already comes with a standard base neckline drafted into it, sitting exactly 7 centimeters down in the front and just 2 centimeters down in the back. Every custom neckline is defined by changing just 3 parameters: the depth, measuring straight down the center front, the width, measuring outward along the shoulder edge, and the shape connecting them. There is one absolute rule: whatever shape you draw, that outer shoulder point must never move, preserving the original seam length. By keeping that shoulder point anchored exactly where it is, you ensure the entire structural fit of the garment's armhole and shoulder remains intact, even if you cut away a massive amount of fabric for an extreme neckline. Now that the foundation is set, we can look at the 7 classic neckline shapes. Each one is simply a specific mathematical variation applied to that base sloper. First is the round, or crew neckline. This requires dropping the front center point just 2 centimeters deeper, widening the shoulder point by 1 centimeter, and connecting them with a smooth, continuous curve. If we take that same rounded concept and drop the center point a full 10 to 12 centimeters down while widening the curve, we get the scoop neckline. The V-neck abandons curves entirely. You mark your desired depth at the center front and draw completely straight diagonal lines from the shoulder points to meet in the middle. The square neckline is built using 3 straight perpendicular lines. You draft straight down from the center, cut across to form a sharp 90-degree corner, and draft straight back up to the shoulder point. The boat, or bateau neckline, flips our proportions. It features a very shallow depth of just 3 to 4 centimeters, combined with maximum width stretching almost all the way horizontally to the shoulder points. This diagram breaks down the geometry of the sweetheart neckline. It relies on a dual curve anatomy, an inward curve dipping down to the center point, flanked by outward bulging curves shaping the bust lobes. Finally, the halter is our outlier. It requires modifying both the neckline and armhole so the fabric loops cleanly behind the back of the neck. Once you master the geometry of these 7 archetypes, you have the drafting vocabulary needed to construct any hybrid neckline you can imagine. Drawing a deep V or scoop neck on paper is easy, but in reality, cutting away that much fabric often leads to a structural failure known as gaping. This video demonstrates exactly what gaping looks like. As the garment shifts, the loose edge of the neckline buckles and falls away from the chest, instead of laying perfectly flat against the skin. To fix this, our first mechanical solution is the neckline dart. This allows you to physically pinch and remove that excess, loose fabric volume directly at the bust line. The second, mandatory preventative measure is applying stay tape. Before you sew any seams, you must iron this non-stretch tape directly onto the edge of any curved neckline to lock the fibers into their drafted shape. Without this stabilization, the bias edges of the fabric will eventually stretch out of shape, causing the neckline to sag and lose its intended fit during wear. Of course, drafting a beautiful shape is useless if the raw cut edge isn't permanently enclosed. To force that edge to lie flat, we use a strict 4-step finishing process. Step 1 is applying an iron-on layer of interfacing to the back of your interior facing piece. This gives the facing the structural rigidity it needs to avoid wrinkling inside the garment. Step 2 requires a choice. You use a standard facing piece for basic fitted styles, but switch to a flexible bias binding strip for extremely curved or tight designs. This split-screen diagram illustrates Step 3, managing seam allowance tension. On the left, we see an inward, concave curve, like the center dip of a sweetheart neckline. To release the tension here, we use a technique called clipping, making straight cuts directly into the fabric edge. On the flip side, when dealing with outward, convex curves like a bust lobe, you have too much fabric crammed into a small space. Here, you use notching, cutting tiny V-shaped wedges out of the seam allowance to physically remove the bulk. If you are sewing a square neckline, you need a specialized corner clip, cutting a single diagonal line exactly to the vertex of that sharp 90-degree angle. Finally, step 4 is shown in this cross-section illustration, understitching. You sew a tight line of thread binding the interfacing layer directly to the hidden seam allowance layer, making sure the top main fabric remains completely untouched by the needle. This stitch forces the facing to roll inward permanently, ensuring it never peeks out onto the front of the finished garment. You now have the exact sequence to draft, stabilize, and fully enclose a custom neckline. A flawlessly smooth, minimalist neckline on the outside requires a heavily engineered interior hidden underneath, packed with stay tape, precise interfacing, exact clips, and targeted understitching. For your practical assignment, draft a V-neck and a sweetheart neckline on your own sloper, and clearly mark the specific zones that will require clipping versus notching. Then, go check your own closet. Turn a few structured garments inside out and locate the interfacing and understitching hiding inside the necklines. The beauty of a silhouette on paper only holds up if the hidden engineering supports it in reality. In our next class, we'll move on to the next major engineering challenge, drafting and attaching collars.